Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'm your embedded multiliteracy tutor for Sociology 305. Thank you for joining me today for this peer review workshop. I'm happy that you're here, and I'm looking forward to talking more about peer review, the benefits of it, and how you can best implement it into your class and for the future. So first off, let's get into what even peer review is. So just briefly, peer review is where you and a peer exchange papers and you provide feedback on your classmate's paper. This feedback oftentimes comes from a classmate, so someone who's taking the same course as you. So in this case, I know that you guys have been doing some peer review already with Professor Sowers, starting that. And what's great about that is that you guys have some context into what the assignment is that you guys are reviewing over, and how to help your peer. So yeah, let's get into different examples of what peer review is. So when we think of peer review, oftentimes it can elicit some positive feelings or negative ones, depending on your experience. So when I think of peer review, some examples of peer review that hasn't been as helpful, at least for me, is when a peer has maybe given me some really vague feedback. So like, for example, let's just say that we have a paper on climate change and the peer gives feedback of, I like this. This is good. I don't understand this. Unclear. Like those are the comments, right? While it's nice that they gave some comments, it doesn't really help me as a reader to understand how to improve the paper because these comments are so short and brief and vague. However, when I think of good examples of peer review, let's go back to that example of the climate change paper. Maybe the peer gives an example of, I really like that you talk about the importance of addressing climate change. However, I don't understand why you focus so heavily in this paragraph on electric vehicles and the need for them. What is the importance of electric vehicles and how can they help us prevent climate change? So that right there is a really great example of good peer review. It not only gives me, the reader, some understanding that me, the writer, some understanding of the reader understands what the point of this paragraph is and is complimenting me a little bit on it, but they're also asking for clarification too. And they're telling me specifically what they want clarification on. They want clarification on why I'm talking about electric vehicles so much and why they're important. So that's a good example of when peer review can be helpful. It's when you're not only trying to be charitable towards the writer, by looking at their paper favorably and trying to give them good, honest feedback, but also too, you're trying to seek understanding and clarification so that way you can help the writer improve their paper. So that way they can not only improve the paper, but become a better writer in the future. So when we look into some of the benefits of peer review, some of them are not only that it helps improve your writing, it also helps to give you a process of giving feedback. It helps you to learn how to give good, effective feedback. Because like we talked about earlier, there's feedback that sometimes isn't super helpful. And then there's feedback that actually helps you to be able to move forward with your paper and to improve. It also helps you to understand how an outside reader views your paper. And what I mean by an outside reader is it's someone who is objective, right? When we're writing our papers, oftentimes it's difficult to not see things only from our point of view or get caught in the thick of it, if you will, because you're just so attached to the paper and you're so close to it, right? So when you have someone who isn't the writer reading your paper, it can be super helpful because that person can maybe point out areas that are in need of improvement that you wouldn't have been able to see yourself because you're just so close to the paper. Also, it helps you to learn from your classmates through their feedback because of this collaborative process, right? When you're talking about writing with someone, sometimes verbalizing it and talking about it with your peer can bring about the most clarity because sometimes writing it down, it's more difficult to clarify your ideas than if you're talking about it with someone first. So those are just some ways that peer review can be super beneficial. There are other ways, of course, that we're going to jump into later, but these are just some that we can touch on in the beginning. So when we're talking about peer review, let's talk about some ways that we can go about it in the best way possible. So before we even start peer review, it's really important to let your reviewer know, or your peer, what you're seeking out of the peer review. So before you give your paper to the reader, you can tell them what are some things that you think are strengths about your paper, and what are some weaknesses that you've identified in your paper. And the reason why that's important to do this is so that way it kind of gives the reader a roadmap or a guideline in which to think about how to review your paper. Because if they already have in mind what you're seeking out of the peer review, some things that you think are good about the paper, and some things you want to work on, then they can try to identify those when they're reading and go, oh, I see that this is a strength of theirs and I agree with them. Or actually, I think that they need to kind of freshen this up a little bit and tighten it up, and I don't really understand it entirely. So maybe it's actually something that they need to work on rather than something that they can identify as a sure strength. Or in consequence, it could be where it's actually that a weakness you see as a strength, or you agree with them that there's a certain area that needs improvement, and you can identify the specific ways in which you think that they could improve those areas. Another thing that's important when we're getting into actually conducting peer reviews, so we're getting into the reading process, right, is reading the paper twice instead of just once. And the reason why is the first time that you're reading the paper, you're just trying to get an understanding of the paper, right? You're just reading it to get an overall feel for the paper and to see even what it's about. And that way, when you read it the second time, you can then have that feedback, or those things that you want, that the writer asked you to keep in mind, the strengths and the weaknesses. So that way, when you're reading it the second time, you know what the paper is about already. So then you can actually give adequate feedback. Because if you're trying to do it the first time that you're reading it, it's going to be a little bit tricky because you're still trying to understand even what the paper's about while you're also giving feedback. Also, when you're doing it the second time, you'll have in mind more of what the macro issues are. And what I mean by macro issues, when we're talking about macro versus micro, I want you to kind of think of it like your paper is a house, okay? So the macro issues are the foundation of the house, the things that are absolutely pivotal for the house to be able to stay standing. So the things like your structure of the paper, the organization, your thesis or your argument, all of those things are essential for the paper or your house to be able to stay standing. Whereas the micro issues are kind of like the fixtures of the house, or the little details, right? Like the paint color, or the details on the windows of the doors, or the furniture inside the house. So the small details that are not necessary for the house to stay standing. So those things in your paper, like the grammar and the syntax, the mechanics, punctuation. So like putting a period somewhere where it's not already, or fixing the verb tense of a sentence, right? Usually those are things that are not essential for reader clarification. So in other words, if you use the wrong verb tense in a sentence, chances are your reader will understand what you're trying to say, right? However, if the thesis is not there, or the thesis is something that is lacking, and there isn't really an argument for the paper, it's going to be really hard to understand what the paper is about. So when we're giving peer review, it's really important to keep those macro issues in mind. It's really, really important to focus on the macro issues, the argument, the structure, the organization, the clarity of the paper. So that way, when you see those things, you can point them out to the reader, because they're essential for the reader to be able to understand the paper. So that way the writer knows about it. Versus the micro issues, those are important too, but they're not essential for the paper to be able to flow and to stand on its own and to have structure and weight and to stand. Hopefully that made sense, that analogy. But that's just something really important to keep in mind, is giving helpful macro feedback. And when we're thinking about helpful macro feedback, a really good practice that we can put into play is giving the compliment sandwich. You may have heard of it in other classes or just in general. It's something that we as tutors at the WMC practice all the time. The compliment sandwich is vital when you're giving feedback. And what the compliment sandwich is think of it like the meat of your sandwich is your critique, and it's sandwiched between the two pieces of bread, your compliment. So when you're giving a critique or a comment in terms of how the writer can improve the paper, it's really important to sandwich that with things that you like about the paper, things that you think that the writer did really well. And the reason why is because then it's more digestible to the reader. If you only give a critique, chances are that the writer is going to be a little bit more sensitive to that critique. And they're going to maybe be a little bit more defensive and take it as a negative thing. Versus if you give compliments sandwiched in between the critique, it creates a more positive atmosphere behind the critique, right? Because at the end of the day, the criticism that we're giving, it's positive criticism. It's to help the writer improve, and it's to help them be able to improve their paper and their writing in the future. It's not to try to knock them down or make them feel bad or anything like that. It's solely to help them become a better writer. And in order to display that, we have to be able to show that we also think that there are really good things the writer is doing currently. Some things that we can do after peer review that are really important are discussing the comments that we give. And what I mean by this is if we're using an in-person environment, for example, when you're giving that feedback, maybe you did it in a written form when you're reading, talking about the comments that you gave, because maybe the writer doesn't really understand some of the feedback that you've given. So being able to talk about some of the comments, sorry, not only alleviates some of the confusion that either party might have about the comments, but it also allows for follow-up questions and clarification from the writer, the reader, vice versa. So that way you guys can gain a greater understanding and some common ground in terms of how this feedback can be best applied in the future. If we're talking about a virtual setting, if we're talking about it in terms of maybe perhaps there isn't any synchronous aspect to it where you guys are talking one-on-one about the feedback, it's only solely via written feedback, giving really detailed comments is important. So like I said earlier, when I was giving an example of a good form of peer review versus a not so great form of peer review, trying to be as detailed as possible, right, with that feedback. So pinpointing exactly what you think was a strength about the paper, and then what you think specifically is in need of improvement, and what you don't understand about the area that you're asking for improvement. Being open also to giving more comments or just like giving clarification about the comments. So like maybe if you're on Google Docs, for example, and you're giving those comments, being open to following up with the writer if they have questions about the comments that you gave is also great as well. So in summary, when you're doing peer review, it's really important beforehand to talk about what you as the writer would like the reviewer to keep in mind when they're reading your paper in terms of strengths and weaknesses. When you're reading the paper as the reviewer, reading it twice is super helpful. So that way you can read it once to gain some understanding of what the paper is about, the second time to be able to give really helpful and appropriate feedback. And then after the peer review, discussing those comments that the reviewer gives. So that way the writer and the reader gain a common understanding of how the writer can move forward and improve their paper. I hope that you guys have found this workshop helpful. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out through me via Canvas. I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have in regards to the course and peer review and the literature review and how to move forward with that. And also you can make an appointment with me at the WMC or with another tutor to talk about your assignments and to get that awesome feedback that we're talking about here. Because at the end of the day, WMC tutors are your peers. We're here to help you and to give you awesome feedback so that way you can move forward feeling more confident about your assignment. But I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in class very soon. Goodbye.